The Israelite exodus and conquest of Canaan is possibly the grandest narrative in the entire biblical Old Testament. But over the last century, the region of the world where this is supposed to have occurred has become the most thoroughly excavated and studied, and nearly every mainstream archaeologist today now rejects the exodus and conquest story as almost entirely fictitious, which means religious apologists have their work cut out for them when attempting to defend the literal inerrancy of this Bible story. But boy do they try. So today, I thought that we could take a look at some of their best arguments. To do that, I've teamed up with two Bible scholars, Dr. Kipp Davis and Dr. Dan McClellan, and an Assyriologist, Dr. Josh Bowen, in order to dissect the arguments of a Christian apologist and Egyptologist named Dr. David Falk, to see if any of the apologist's arguments actually hold water. Anyone who grew up in church knows the story of the Exodus. Israel enslaved in Egypt. Moses is like, "Yo, Pharaoh,
let my people go."
Plagues, the Red Sea parts. 2 million slaves flee. Egypt's army drowned. 40 years of tumbling through the desert, then invasion. The ragtag Hebrew army serves the Canaanites a heaping helping of genocide. They exterminate the inhabitants of over 300 cities before claiming the land of Canaan as their own. The problem is,
when you look at all of the archaeological evidence, all the way from the Egyptian Delta up through Jordan and into the West Bank and to Israel proper, there is simply no archaeological evidence in support of a unified military conquest, and a great deal of evidence against it.
In my episode of Nothing Fails Like Bible History on the conquest of Joshua, I briefly discussed the lack of evidence which you would expect to find had there been such a widespread ethnic cleansing and cultural replacement by an invading force. In order to grapple with this reality, Christian apologists and theologians have to completely reinterpret the text using some pretty elaborate mental gymnastics. The numbers are all figurative. It was a smaller invading force. The towns were smaller than described. Most of them weren't actually destroyed. The people weren't exterminated, they were displaced, and so on. A while back, a Christian apologist and Egyptologist named Dr. David Falk responded to one of my videos using every one of these tactics. So today, I've recruited the help of 3 scholars to explore his claims and see if any of them hold water.
And I'm not afraid of holy Kool-Aid, not one bit.
You will be. You will be.
In my video, I talked about how Joshua and the Israelite army are commanded to totally exterminate the inhabitants of Canaan.
One of the things that Holy Kool-Aid is going to do is he is going to emphasize the word totally. You must destroy them totally. Well, one of the things is that totally is not in the Hebrew text. It's a translation. It's a translation of the term harem. The idea that you must destroy utterly or totally.
This is a problematic approach, not only to this verb, but to this context, because he says totally is not in the Hebrew, but the Hebrew uses a specific verbal construction called the paronomastic infinitive, where you have the verb form twice, once in the infinitive absolute and then once in a conjugated finite form. And here the infinitive and the finite form are both in the hifil, which is the causative stem. That is usually used to emphasize the certainty with which something will happen, or to emphasize the severity of something happening. So translating totally destroy is not an inaccurate way to understand the use of the paronomastic infinitive here, because it is emphasizing that this destruction must happen, will certainly happen. It is emphasizing the totality of it.
Now, the problem with harem, and this was pointed out by John Walton, is that harem can have a range of meaning. And unfortunately, this exegesis does not come out when we look at a translation. This is the difference between translations and scholarship. A translation will probably take what the translators think is the most likely translation, but scholarship looks at what is the best exegesis, which is how do we interpret these texts. And harem has a range of meaning, from banish to forbidden to destroy. And any one of these meanings could be applicable when we talk about a passage like Deuteronomy 7:1-2. You must banish them, or they are forbidden to you. The thought that John Walton had was many of these passages were not so much destroying totally, but to drive them out. Drive the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites out of the land.
The texts in Joshua where this word appear have defined it for us. Like, we don't even have to work that hard. Just look at Joshua chapter 10. The text describes the Haram in very specific terms of Eglon. He says, every living thing that was in it on that day, he made a Cherem offering, like everything he did in Lachish. At Hebron, he struck it with the sword, its king, its towns, and everything that was in it. He did not let any survive, just like everything he did to Eglon, and he made a Cherem offering of it and every living thing in it. Every instance where this term is applied to a specific city that is attacked by Israel, it's used in this sense where the definition is supplied by the narration of what happens. It's the same thing you see for Jericho, for Ai. You're exactly right. This is the place where the term is rather explicitly defined by the writer, making sure that we understand what's going on here. The point of the text is to convey the sense that the destruction was total, that every person who lived in these cities that Israel attacked did not survive. It's repeated several times that Joshua and his forces are putting all the residents of Ai to the sword. This is a slaughter.
And again, the utterly destroyed, that is just, utterly is not in the text. Destroyed is haram. Again, that's banish, drive out, or destroy. Any one of those could be the option there.
Look it up in a Hebrew lexicon. Look it up in one of these. This is a theological dictionary of the Old Testament. You are not going to find any text where to banish or to drive out is ever an optional gloss for the verb haram. You're just not going to find it.
To beat off this dead horse even further, you've got the story of the Gibeonites, who, knowing that Israel was wiping out all of the inhabitants of the land, dressed up in rags and carried moldy bread, pretending to be from a faraway land, in order to trick the Israelites into promising to spare them.
The whole point of the Gibeonites is that they go, shit just got real. Here come the Israelites, and they're going
to annihilate us.
Yeah,
like everybody else.
Why didn't they leave? Shouldn't they just leave? That was the merciful thing, right? That's what they should have. They should have been like, yes, we can just leave. No, they do this elaborate ruse, right? They pretend to be from a far-off city so that they get a treaty, knowing that Israel will honor that treaty. That's the whole point of the narrative. That's what makes this such an anomaly, is that people aren't giving up. They're not giving up. They are fighting. Did you think that they just knocked and everybody opened the gates and said, we surrender? No, right? The narrative itself is saying they're putting up a fight.
Of course, anyone who did even first-year Hebrew would know this.
Unfortunately, over and over and over again, David demonstrated that unlike actual Bible scholars like Kipp Davis, Dan McClellan, who actually worked as a Bible translator for years, and Josh Bowen, who literally wrote a book on how to read ancient Hebrew, unlike them, David only had a basic understanding of Hebrew. He didn't just butcher pronunciations.
Harem.
He misunderstood words, and he regurgitated old washed-up apologetics talking points based off of linguistic interpretations that have long been discarded by any serious scholar. But maybe you're like David Falk, and you're stuck at the beginner level of your language learning journey. If you actually want to master a language, then I genuinely recommend today's sponsor, LingoPie. I've been learning languages my entire life, and LingoPie is by far my favorite method. I've seen a million bad ways to learn a language, and it's important to be fully immersed and to have fun, which is why I actually bought a lifetime subscription to LingoPie long before they offered to sponsor the channel. It's that good. Here's what makes it stand out. LingoPie helps you learn by watching real movies and TV shows from the countries where your language is spoken. You are immersed, but with built-in support. Every subtitle is clickable for an instant translation, and the word then gets automatically saved as a flashcard that you can practice and review later. later. There's also an AI grammar coach that explains meanings and context, and a pronunciation tool that listens to you speak and gives feedback so that you can sound like a real human being, and not like this.
Arim.
LingoPie has over 3,000 movies and TV shows in 14 different languages, and you can use it on desktop, mobile, or smart TV. It turns learning from a chore into something that you actually look forward to. So if you are ready to learn a new language or level up your skills, click the link below for a 7-day free trial plus a 55% discount on their annual plan. Thank you. In my video, I then listed off 9 cities that Joshua is said to have exterminated. In an attempt to explain why these cities lack major destruction layers from this time, Falk then pulled this card.
Of that list of cities that Holy Kool-Aid just named, only one of those is destroyed with fire. The other are haremmed, but they are not destroyed with fire. Only that last one, Hatzor, is destroyed with fire.
Wrong. 3 of them are explicitly said to have been burned to the ground, but this is a completely irrelevant red herring because an entire city doesn't need to burn to the ground in order for there to be evidence of its destruction, ethnic cleansing, or cultural replacement.
In a lot of places which are mentioned to have been destroyed by the Israelites, there's a continuity of Canaanite culture that just continues through this period. There is other sites, such as which appear to have been abandoned at the time that the conquest took place. The point is that there are inconsistencies in the text in terms of how the description of destruction aligns with what we see in the archaeological record. If there's this wholesale replacement of population, Israelites coming in and driving out the Canaanites, just pushing them all out of the way, this is still something that we should be able to detect and identify, even if we don't see massive destructions of a city in some of the layers. You should see this reflected in pottery, or maybe even in some of the architecture or the artifactual remains.
If the argument here is that these cities weren't destroyed in a way that would leave material indicators or that would be invisible to the archaeological record, I think that relies on his notion that Cherem does not refer to complete and total destruction, but the population, the presence of people in these cities before and after is also going to be a pretty significant indicator of whether or not an actual genocide has successfully been accomplished. And so if the argument is that if they weren't destroyed with fire, then we can't say for sure that they were not conquested or the prophecy or the command was not fully carried out. I don't think that's supported.
All the cities were fenced with high walls, gates, bars, beside unwalled towns, a great many, and we utterly destroyed them. The question is, what is the them? This is where a competent Bible scholar versus a hobbyist, amateur, really shows a difference. All these cities were fortified with high walls, gates, and bars, besides a great many unwalled towns. And we utterly destroyed them, verse 6, as we did to Sihon, king of Heshbon, utterly destroying the men, women, children of every city. What is the them? Because what Holy Kool-Aid wants to do here is make the case that the cities themselves were completely destroyed, razed with fire so that there are destruction layers.
Nope. As I just stated, an entire city doesn't need to burn to the ground in order for there to be evidence of its destruction, ethnic cleansing, or cultural replacement.
The problem is that the them is a masculine plural pronoun, and the pronoun has to match number and gender with its referent. This is just a technical way of saying that to know what the them is, you have to match it with the subject, or whatever the object is. Now, the problem with cities or towns in this particular translation is that is the word erim, which is feminine. It's a feminine plural noun. So the them cannot refer to cities. It refers to the people. It refers to the men, women, and children of those towns.
Erim.
Erim.
If you're going to get really pedantic and like talk down to people that have never claimed that they know the Hebrew language, fucking learn to pronounce the Hebrew words yourself.
He's flexing. This is Falk flexing. I don't think it's the flex that he wants it to be, because does this help his case to set the focus on the referent of the verb for total annihilation being the people as opposed to the cities? Does that somehow, like, what's he gaining through that? I don't know. That seems bad to me.
Here's the position, just to make it abundantly clear that I think all three of us are espousing here. Destruction layers do not require city being burned. Destruction layers do not require massive amounts of citywide destruction of structures. There's a whole article about this by Kramerman. Is that who it is?
Yeah. Kramerman.
And he talks about what the different kinds of destruction layers are. Like, it's everybody watching should just go read that article. I mean, it's really useful. So things like dead bodies are not required in order to have a destruction. Like, anyway, the position I think that we're all espousing here is that the idea that if the text is correct, that the 60 cities in Transjordan of Sihon were taken by the Israelites. There are some things that you would expect to see in the archaeological record, and we don't see them. That's the point. Furthermore, if we legitimately understand the text to be saying that the people en masse are to be wiped out, be they killed or driven away, is irrelevant, honestly. You expect to see some things in the archaeological record that we don't see, and that's why archaeologists hold this position.
I am getting the sense from this presentation already that Holy Kool-Aid is not so much following what the Bible says, but an interpretation or a impression of what the Bible says about the Israelite conquest.
As the kettle said to the pot.
There's no such thing as what the Bible says apart from an interpretation of what the Bible says. All reading is interpreting, so nobody has any choice but to interpret.
The text is not actually saying that the cities themselves, the walls, the gates, the houses, the occupation zones were destroyed. It's not saying that. It is saying that it was the people who were driven out. And this sort of makes sense. And the reason this makes sense is because the Israelites are coming into the land to occupy it. They're not there to conquer it, per se. They're not just there to destroy and pillage it. They're there to re-inhabit it. They want to inhabit it, move into the houses, and set up home. So they're not going to destroy cities unnecessarily. They're going to capture cities. And we see this in Deuteronomy 3, verse 4, the verse just before this one. Context matters. Where the verse says, and we captured all his cities at this time. The verb is lakad. Lakad means to capture or seize. So they captured these cities to occupy them. They didn't destroy them with fire. They captured them to inhabit them.
If we look at Joshua 8:19, and this is just doing like 7 seconds of research. And the men in ambush rose quickly from their place, and when he had stretched out his hand, they ran and entered the city. This is about the city of Ai. They ran and entered the city, and they lachaded it. They captured it. And then it says, and they set it on fire. So this idea that captured means they had to then use it, it just doesn't work with 6 seconds of lexicography. Because that's what I heard him saying. Look, they seize it here.
Yeah.
And so that means that they're going to use it.
They didn't destroy them with fire. They captured them to inhabit them.
That just doesn't work.
Now, in time, they started demolishing them and rebuilding them during the Iron Age. But that sort of occupational destruction isn't the same as a conquest. That's more like gentrification, where you buy it properly, demolish it, and rebuild it to the way you like it. That's what we see. You're going to see at Jericho during the Iron Age, and potentially, possibly, throughout the Levant.
The question is, was there continued occupation? Was there conquest? Was the city taken over and fully occupied by the invading force, and only later did they make decisions to rebuild it? Or do archaeologists suggest that It was destroyed. Some small groups of people later made their way into this occupational vacuum to squat, as Deaver says, only for later larger populations who are looking for a new place to live come in and say, well, we got to rebuild this so that we can occupy it as an actual civilization, as an actual full-size population. The latter is what the archaeology indicates. This is just trying to renegotiate a way to understand the archaeological data in a way that allows the conquest to still sound historical.
I then pointed out in my video that we're not dealing with a handful of towns here. The book of Joshua lists over 300 cities where destruction and ethnic cleansing is said to have taken place. And here, Falk completely missed my point in a way that feels almost deliberately obtuse.
Actually, that's not an unreasonable number. Hundreds of cities would have been in Levant. Because when we look at, say, the toponym lists, and toponym is a fancy word for place names, of, say, Tutmosis III or Ramses II, we see hundreds of names being listed. Even Ramses III has hundreds of names listed on the toponym list. 309? That's not an unreasonable number. So, if this had been a fictitious mythologizing of the Israelite conquest, we might expect a much smaller list. But the fact that it includes all 309 towns, Holy Kool-Aid here has probably unwittingly shown another proof for the Israelite conquest. Wow. Thank you, Holy Kool-Aid. You've done a service to biblical scholarship.
The point is not that there couldn't have been 300 cities, towns, and villages in this area. It's that destruction and genocide of this scale would leave evidence in the archaeological record. And that is not something that Christian apologists want to address.
Why would we have to address the 300 cities? Because they weren't destroyed, they were captured, they were occupied. Again, we take the biblical text on its own merits, not what you say it to be. The fact is that the Bible claims that most of these cities were captured for Israelite use. That's not the same of having them destroyed. You're not going to find destruction layers at most of them, because that would defeat the entire point of capturing them. This is a silly argument.
And this is ignoring the population data, the inhabitation data, and he wants to focus just on Deuteronomy and say, see, it wasn't saying they were killing everybody, which ignores the statement in Deuteronomy 2 that they left no survivors. But if you look in Joshua, it says that in the whole area they killed everything that breathed and they left no survivors and no one was left alive. That kind of genocide would leave evidence in the material record. If these cities are just continually inhabited and there's no indication of any kind of change, then that precludes either everybody being run out and an entirely different ethnic group just deciding to occupy them, or the killing of everybody, which is what is very clearly indicated in the text. So he's just retreating from and trying to dodge the data by throwing up these weak apologetic deflections.
We wouldn't expect them to be destroyed, because harem doesn't necessarily mean destroy. It can mean destroy. Harem can also mean to banish and drive out, or to be forbidden. Again, you have to understand the language when you approach the text. Understanding the language is paramount. You cannot understand the text unless you understand the language. And the language here has great semantic range. So, again, somebody who doesn't know anything about biblical studies and biblical Hebrew is going to make these mistakes.
I think this is a pretty disingenuous and disrespectful, continual rhetorical dismissal of these arguments as just being based on ignorance of the Hebrew, because Falk is wildly misrepresenting both Deuteronomy and Joshua, both of which repeatedly in the context make clear that this is about the killing of all of the inhabitants, not their driving out. So the argument that haram there needs to be interpreted as to banish, meaning driving out, is nonsense. That's just pure and utter nonsense.
Isn't he then basically saying that the entirety of the Bible is outside of the grasp of 99% of the world that doesn't speak
pretty much
Hebrew? He's saying that the translations aren't good enough. You cannot interpret the text. You cannot take the Bible literally, and that there's been a problem of transmission.
It's a very
down
good
through
point.
the pages.
Yeah. No, I think you're right about that.
I then pointed out how the archaeological record shows that cities in this area which were actually destroyed in the late Bronze Age were destroyed over the course of 1 to 1.5 centuries, not the narrow 5-year window described in the Hebrew Bible.
Look at that. 40 years, 80 years, 85. Clearly, the Holy Kool-Aid is not aware of the problem that 40 years represents in chronological statements. 40 years is essentially an idiom for meaning an extended long time. We see this throughout the Old Testament. We see this throughout the ancient Near East. Clearly, he's unaware of it.
First of all, making it a blanket assumption that everywhere that it says 40 years has to be symbolic is just not methodologically sound. There's a difference between what a number might mean or a symbolic value that a number might have, and yet the narrative itself, its internal frame of reference, still implies that number have meaning in the narrative itself from a chronological aspect. Now, that's not always the case, but like 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a whale, that doesn't mean that you can make the argument that Jonah was just in there for 25 minutes. You don't get to do that because 3 has a very significant symbolic value. These things have to be taken on a case-by-case basis, and you have to make very good arguments for why that should be the case.
And just what exactly is the context here? Well, in the Southern Campaign, Joshua fights a battle against 5 kings, slaughters them, and then goes from town to town to town, destroying them, subjecting the populations to Cherem, and it says,
Joshua took Makkedah on that day. So it's like the same day that he killed all the kings.
Joshua then slaughters the inhabitants of Libnah and takes the city of Lachish on the second day, immediately fights a successful battle against Gezer, and then hops over to Eglon and takes the city on that day.
These seem to be happening on subsequent days, and at the end of this passage, it says here that Joshua took all these kings and their land. Here, the word is pa'am echat, in one moment, at one time. The idea is that this is all just comprehensive, a singular campaign.
The idea here seems to be that this was one campaign. It certainly doesn't support the notion that they took one part and then they regrouped and then years passed and then they went out on a separate campaign to take another part. It seems to be a single campaign.
Later on in the northern campaign, it says that Joshua made war with those kings for many days, not many weeks or months or years. Many days. So like this is all pretty compressed.
Now, the funny thing is, I am and was very aware of the symbolic values of numbers like 40 in the ancient Near East. But here's the problem with that. 40 years doesn't simply mean an ambiguously long period of time in most modern languages which the Bible's been translated into. And yet, that is exactly how it's been translated. So, you either have a statement which was originally meant to be taken literally by the Bible's authors, but doesn't fit the archaeological data, or you have a glaring mistranslation leading to mass confusion, a problem of transmission, which is nothing new. I mean, I've done entire videos on how the Bible has been changed and altered over time. But what the heck is the point of having a holy text of such importance being divinely inspired without it being divinely preserved? Falk knows this, which is why he says...
Now, he takes it from the NIV, which is not exactly the best translation.
See, the NIV was written as evangelical propaganda. They didn't stick closely to the oldest and most reliable manuscripts and deliberately wrote biblical contradictions out of the text in an attempt to harmonize it, as I demonstrated in this video here. But it's still the #1 best-selling Bible in the US, and millions of people worldwide treat it as literal history. He won't admit it, but Falk knows that the evidence for the Exodus and the conquest of Canaan is utterly lacking. So finally, he retreats to the Christian apologist's favorite platitude for when the evidence on the ground doesn't match the narrative in the text.
Even if we say that there is no late Bronze city at Eitel, that's absence of evidence. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Many an archaeologist has gotten into trouble because he has interpreted absence of evidence as evidence of absence, and clearly Holy Kool-Aid has no clue about.
Falk, if you had done just a little bit of research on me, you would know that I already addressed this cliche bullshit excuse in this exact same series when I eviscerated Trent Horn of Catholic Answers. So allow me to educate you on why exactly this isn't the brilliant defense that you think it is.
It's really common that Christians will argue that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. In other words, our lack of evidence isn't proof that it didn't happen, which is not a good argument at all. For example, if you tell your insurance agent that your car was crushed under a semi today, and they come over to inspect it, but there isn't a ding or scratch anywhere on your car or on you, you can't just get annoyed at your insurance agent's skepticism and blurt out, just because there's no evidence, it doesn't mean I wasn't crushed under a semi, because it kind of does. If the scenario necessitates that said evidence should be there if it happened. By the same reasoning, if millions of Hebrews lived in Egypt for over 400 years, summoned down plagues, killing every firstborn Egyptian male, drowned the Pharaoh's army in a divinely divided Red Sea, and then wandered in the desert for 40 years living on magic bread before invading Canaan and slaughtering all of its inhabitants, you would and should expect substantial evidence for such events. Instead, so far, we just have excuse after excuse for why there isn't anything.
Now there's one major argument Falk touched on that still deserves attention. Throughout his response, he repeatedly tried to talk down the size of the biblical conquest, painting the conquered cities as potentially just these tiny little hovels, rather than massive fortresses and kingdoms capable of fielding giant standing armies. But when I started digging deeper into the actual settlement sizes compared to the description of them in the biblical narrative, for me, that was one of the biggest smoking guns that this story was not an actual historical account, but was a later retrojection of an Iron Age reality onto a Bronze Age canvas, most likely for the purpose of political propaganda. But this video is already getting long, so I'll have to cover that in my next video. So make sure that you're subscribed and click the notification bell. And while you're waiting for that, check out part 1 of this response to David Falk. This is actually part 2. I released part 1 at the same time as this video, and I cover the slimy and dishonest tactics used by Christian apologists, Falk in particular, and I show why experts and scholars no longer take them seriously. Massive thank you to Dan, Josh, and Kipp for helping me with both of these videos. They are absolute legends. I've linked to all of their channels below, so make sure that you go check out their work, subscribe to them, and let them know that I sent you. If you guys appreciate videos like this, your support is what allows me to do this full time. So if you want to support more videos like this, you can make either a per video pledge on patreon.com/holykoolaid or a one-time PayPal donation. Thank you guys so much, and as always, dare to be curious, but don't drink the Kool-Aid.